Hello, I wanted to talk today about a project I've been working on, a first-person physics-based platformer and puzzler. There are three main parts of this prototype I wanted to break down: the pulling force, how the player interacts with the world by applying a physics force on the face of an object; Puppet, a shadow NPC that is rendered to a decal, but is also partially animated and talks to the player; and finally, the physics controller that helps make the gameplay feel oddly loose, but hopefully creates a unique experience. Different physics items are interactable using a left click over them. This attaches a force direction that pulls the item in the given vector. The player is able to use three at once and are able to reuse a given force on the same object on a different location without bringing in an additional vector. This mechanic is accomplished by setting out a raycast and upon a successful intersection applies logic based on some metadata. Different objects may require different logic to act in a way that is expected by the player. Our goal is to make them feel that a force is being applied in the given direction, but the way in which we implement that experience may differ than how we might expect. An example are the sliders I started programming. Here, I wanted an object that would slide along a given path created within the editor that could span some arbitrary amount of points and use any curve I desired. The natural choice was to utilize Godot's built-in Path3D and PathFollow3D. The issue with these items is that they constrain what we will be working with, as we can only translate along using the progress variable, which is not inherently physics-based. There are two main approaches that came up that I could have taken. One is to adjust the constraints in the physics logic manually. This would require me to connect our physics object to a PathFollow3D. And although this method would set up useful tools and experience for a physics-based project, I decided to go with an alternative, faster approach. I set up a state machine that shows whether the slider is idle, moving, or slowing down. Each state has logic that helps imitate a physics object. The great addition to this is including a collision box around it so it still affects other entities within the world, like the player. Remember, what we do as game developers is setting up expectations for the player and meeting them, but how we meet that pattern may differ from situation to situation. The second mechanic I wanted to discuss was how I created Puppet. Decals are a way we can project textures onto different surfaces. I wanted Puppet to be formed using sign distance fields and for them to be interactive with the world. To do this, it requires a shader for me to process and form the body, sclera, and pupil. These are simply formed by a square and two circles. To connect the shader image to the decal image, I render to a subviewport, which allows me to get its texture. Subviewports are a way to render its different children to a rect, and then we can apply that texture where needed. For debugging purposes, you can attach a subviewport to a subviewport container, which will display our image using a UI element. To get the eye to match up, I get the direction towards the player's head and convert the value as if local to Puppet. I then pass it into an eye shader, which offsets the center of the pupil. The final aspect of this project I'd like to talk about is the player controller. To keep an interactive experience, I wanted the player to be flung about from all the physics objects within the scene. The natural starting point within Godot would be the rigid body component rather than the character body. The movement simply applies a force to the given input direction, but I particularly like how the body is technically floating above the ground. This was inspired, professionally borrowed, from Very Very Valet by Toyful Games. I highly recommend viewing their video linked below. Essentially, the player sends a raycast down and springs towards a given offset. This means the player bounces up when falling, can do pseudo-ledged climbs, smoothly runs on imperfect terrain, and when going down ramps can stick to the surface instead of running into the air before falling. I really enjoy how the controller feels and will be using it in future projects. That is all I have for you today. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like for me to continue making content, place a comment below. Thank you and goodbye.